Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Oh, I have you unmuted. So yeah, let me mention that. I have you all muted. We've had a few problems with some issues with that. So for the presentation, you will all be on mute. Um, if you have questions as I am going over the information for the workshop, what I would recommend you do is in the chat. Um, yes, I'm recording this. As I go over the chat, you are going to write in your questions in the chat, and then I will answer them at the end of the presentation. I would also like you all, if possible, so that you remember, to please sign in on the link posted in the chat box, so that way we know who's participating. Also, if you need verification for participation in the workshop, for some type of special program or something, that's how we would be able to do that. So again, there will be a question and answer at the end of the presentation when I'm done going over all the different slides for the PowerPoint, that you can then ask whatever questions you may have, they come up. So again, welcome. My name is Oscar Galindo. I'm a counselor at Santa Monica College, and the workshop is going to be on transferring to an elite private university. So that's what we're going to be going over this afternoon. Okay. I think the first thing we need to do is address what types of schools I'm actually going to be talking about, because it's going to be a very, very limited number of schools. Elite institutions, and the way I'm talking about them or defining them is based on admission selectivity, meaning how hard is it to be admitted to these schools. The majority of the universities that fit the elite profile that I'm going to be going over today have a transfer rate of somewhere between 0 and 10%. So again, not very many who are applying are being admitted to these schools. That's what we're going to be talking about, right? These types of schools. I do this presentation because I feel, well, we, Santa Monica College, we feel we have a lot of really good students at Santa Monica College who would be very good candidates for these schools. We think that a lot more students at SMC should have these schools as options. Unfortunately, not nearly as many students from SMC apply to these schools as we would like. So this is one step in maybe getting students to consider these schools, right? To make these schools options, right? To get them on your list of potential transfer schools. So I do understand that what we are asking you to potentially do has a very, very low success rate, right? But having said that, I can tell you that there are students from SMC who have transferred to these schools. So, is it possible? Yes, it is absolutely possible. We would probably have a lot more students transferring to these schools if we had more students applying, right? So that's the whole idea, is to get more student interest, right? To get students to put these schools on their offer list, right? So, but again, I understand that what we're proposing is or are schools that have very, very low admission rates, right? So I do understand that. Now we're gonna go over just basically when we talk about elite institutions, what schools are we actually talking about, right? So we're clear about what kind of schools we're gonna be covering. So the first group would be the Ivy League, right? I would say that's probably, or this is probably the most well-known, most famous, if you will, list of schools in the United States, right? So the Ivy League are the usually, again, most well-known. They're all private. They're all on the East Coast, and they're all probably the oldest schools in the United States. They include Brown University, Columbia University, Cornell University, Dartmouth, Harvard, Princeton, the University of Pennsylvania, and Yale. So that's what makes up the Ivy League. There are some more schools, though, that would fit the elite definition. So, before I get to those other schools, let me just go over this real quick. This slide shows the transfer rates for the Ivy League in general, right? So all the schools are listed there. That second column has the transfer rate. That would mean the percentage of students who applied for transfer admission were accepted. So again, if you notice, the numbers generally are very, very low. The third column, transfers applied, that means how many students did they actually, or how many applications did they actually get for transfer? And then the accepted number on the far right, that fourth column. I do want to make a point that for these schools, transfer means students who are coming from another school. They don't distinguish between four-year schools and community colleges and all that. And the majority of the students who are accepted to these schools as transfer students are actually students who are attending other four-year universities. So this is, for example, a student who is currently attending UCLA, who then transfers and goes to Cornell, for example. The number of transfer students accepted who are from community colleges like SMC is a very, very small number. Yeah, the majority of transfer students that they take are usually students who are attending other four-year universities. So once again, I understand that what I'm asking you to contemplate is the numbers are not good, the application rates are not good, the admission rates, I'm sorry, are not good. But we definitely know that if we had more students applying to these schools, we would have more students admitted, right? So now getting back to what schools fit into this elite profile, in addition to the Ivy League, in California, we do have a few schools. They would include the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, Claremont McKenna College, Pomona College, and Stanford University. The two in the middle, Claremont McKenna College and Pomona College, they are both small private liberal arts colleges located in, Southern California. They're in the Southern California area. They're part of the Claremont Consortium. And yeah, there are these schools that a lot of students, even in LA, don't really know about, but they are very, very good, very, very competitive. Yeah, very, very competitive. They would fit in that elite profile in terms of admission rate for transfer. So, and in California, that's it. So again, these four schools are private. So no UCs, no Cal States, not USC, not Pepperdine, not Loyola, right? So again, we have a lot of private schools in California, but these are the only four that would kind of fit that profile right there. Other schools in the United States that would fall into this elite institution group would be the University of Chicago, Duke, Johns Hopkins University, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and Northwestern. Those are other examples. There are other smaller private liberal arts colleges, schools like maybe Swarthmore and Bryn Mawr and schools like that. But I'd say these are the most well-known, the top, comprehensive universities, right, that fit into this profile. So again, at the end of the day, not very many schools are going to fit into this elite profile. But the lists that I've shown you so far, I think a lot of you would say, yeah, but those are probably the most well-known, the most famous, whatever, the best. I don't like to use the word the best, or the term the best, but it comes up a lot, right? That these are the best schools or whatever. So they're definitely very good schools, that's for sure. So what we're going to go over in the workshop is the admission criteria, right? So if you are interested in potentially applying to some of these schools right now that I've gone over, the schools that make up the elite group, we're going to look at, well, what factors are they looking at in the admissions process, right? So they would include things like grade point average, units, major requirements, general education requirements. They have testing requirements very often. Things like extracurricular activities, work experience, other things that go into the application process include the students writing potentially multiple essays and also having to get multiple letters of recommendation. And if you go far enough in the process, potentially you'll be asked to interview. So we're going to go over those one by one, okay? So the first one is grade point average. I would say probably that's going to be the most important factor in the application, if I had to pick one. Notice that I write, you must have a 4.0 GPA to be admitted. And then on the bottom there, it says, just kidding, right? The little asterisk explaining that that's not true. But I do have a lot of students who feel this, that if they don't have a 4.0, that the odds of getting in are zero, or that's somehow a requirement. It's definitely not. The elite universities being discussed in this workshop all are private, and because they're private, they generally do not give minimum GPA requirements for transfer admission. So they don't literally tell you, you must have this minimum GPA. Bottom line is, because they're private, they can take anybody for whatever reason they want. That's just the bottom line. Again, having said that, the overwhelming majority of students who get into these schools as transfer students are going to have very high GPAs, right? So it does say there in the slide, I never discourage an applicant. So if a student came in with a 2.7 and they tell me they want to apply to Harvard and Stanford and Princeton, and I'm not going to discourage that, but what I would encourage is that in addition to those schools, that they also have other options just in case those schools end up not working out, right? If they end up not getting into those schools. So that's what I write there at the end. I do encourage the students have multiple transfer options, right? UCs, Cal States, and potentially other private schools that may not necessarily be so difficult to be admitted, right, from the admission standpoint. The GPA range, again, that I would recommend is somewhere between a 3.0 to a 4.0. Obviously, the closer to a 4, I would say the better. This is a recommendation, not a requirement. Okay, so bottom line, you want to have good grades, right? The better your grades, probably the better chance you're going to have of getting admitted. Units. Again, all of these schools that we're talking about are private, right? So most elite institutions require the transfer candidates complete 30 units prior to transfer. So that 30 unit is basically completing 1 year of college. If we look at college as a 4-year experience, right, they would really prefer that you be at their schools for, if possible, for 3 of the 4 years. So completing 1 year prior to transfer, that's really what they're looking at ideally. That's what they would want you to do. These schools also end up being available for transfer much sooner than the UC and Cal State, because the UC and Cal State require 60 units, which would be the equivalent basically of completing 2 years, right? So they're opening the door, let's say, for transfer much sooner. And that really goes for pretty much all private schools, even if they're not elite. I don't think I've ever researched a private school for transfer that requires more than 30 units. So if you have 30 units, other than UC and Cal State, you're probably going to be eligible for transfer. And to the schools that I'm speaking of for this workshop, you definitely, after 30 units, are going to be able to transfer potentially. What else here? Yes, so I already said that. All right, so let's move on. When it comes to coursework, okay, that always comes up is, well, if I want to go to these schools, what should I be taking, right? What would be my educational plan, or what classes need to make up my plan, right, for what it is I need to do. And so, again, these elite institutions tend to be very flexible when it comes to specific coursework for transfer. Most do not list any required courses needed prior to transfer. So they literally they will not say that you must have, English courses or math courses or any specific list of courses generally. Because admission to an elite institution is so competitive, I do encourage students to follow UC and CSU educational plans that incorporate major and general education coursework. I do this, or I recommend this, because the odds of getting into a UC or a Cal State are much greater. And also the UC and Cal State have very specific course requirements, unit requirements, major requirements, general education requirements, right, for transfer. So by using these models, the UC and the Cal State, you're pretty much going to be able to transfer to these elite schools in terms of the coursework. Okay, So I would say that using, for example, iGETSI, I hope a lot of you are familiar with that. That would be the GE model for UC and Cal State, right? So I would recommend you probably follow that. For the major requirements, again, they're really not real specific about coursework needed for major. The two caveats that I will point out though for major would be majors that involve science, anything science-based, bio, chemistry, things like that, and also majors that are engineering, because those majors do have very specific course requirements for the majors, and the major course requirements do tend to be universal for the most part. And by that I mean that no matter where you want to transfer, if you're going to be a bio major, you're going to be an engineering major, the course requirements are going to be very similar. So and because those majors do have a lot of major requirements, right? If you definitely know you're going to be a science major, you're going to be an engineering major, computer science, something like that, starting to take coursework for those majors would be good. And again, if you were to follow major requirements for majors like that at the UC, UCLA, Berkeley, whatever, even Cal States, odds are you're going to be taking the coursework they would want anyway. So that would be my recommendation, to continue to follow or follow a UC CSU educational plan. Because if you're doing that, odds are you're going to meet the requirements for these private schools as well. Testing, here's where it gets a little bit different. Again, these schools, the majority of them, they do require testing. The tests that I'm referencing here, the SAT and the ACT, in the US, those are generally tests, students take while they are in high school, right? So most students who are going to take these exams in the United States are high school students, and they're taking them of attending universities right when they get out of high school as freshmen, meaning they're not going to go the community college route, right? But you're all at SMC, so you have taken that route, but these elite schools still require, for the most part, that you've taken the SAT or the ACT. So if you have taken the exam already in high school, if you did that, then technically you already meet the requirement. You don't necessarily need to take the exam again. But this is one of the most common questions I'm asked, is if I took the exam in high school, I don't feel I did very well. I feel that if I took the exam again, I would do much better. What do you think? Should I take it over or not? Usually my recommendation is no. And that recommendation comes from discussions I've had with representatives from all of these schools. And all of these schools generally say if the student's taken the exam already, they don't really recommend they take it again. That said, if the student wants to take the exam, students can people can take the SAT or the ACT whenever they want. It's a test that you must pay for, right? It's a private test. So they'll take your money as often as you want to pay to take the test. So, but the bottom line is the requirement that these schools have for testing is that you have taken the test. If you took it in high school, you meet the requirement. If you have not taken the test, then you need to take the test. And it doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how long ago you were in high school. It doesn't matter what your GPA is or anything like that. They usually require that you take the test regardless. So I've had 30-year-olds who are applying to these schools who have taken the SAT because they had never taken it when they were in high school. So, yeah, bottom line is you're probably going to have to take the test if you haven't already. If you've taken the test already, you probably will not take it again. So, and this requirement, yes, usually extends to all students, including international students. At this particular workshop, I do tend to get a lot of international students, and I want to make that point that international students will also be held to the same testing requirement. Okay, in addition to the academics, right? So we've talked about GPA, we've talked about units, we've talked about general education and major requirements. We've talked about this testing issue with SAT and ACT. So these schools, in addition to all that, they want to know, what else do you do? So besides school, besides your courses, what else are you doing with your time, right? So um, all schools, it does say there, most universities, not just elite institutions, want to know what a student is involved in outside of class, right? So um, there are no magic activities that guarantee admission if you participate in them, right? I get a lot of students asking me, what would be the good things that I should do, or what would be the things that are really going to help me. And um, my opinion when it comes to this, and the guideline that I'm recommending here, is to seek quality activity over quantity. And by that I mean, I see a lot of students who feel that join every club, they want to be involved in everything, because they think that they're going to be able to then list all these activities on their application, and that in and of itself is going to make them a better applicant. And I would say, and again, this is referencing a lot of conversations I've had with representatives from these schools. They have told us that they would prefer to see quality activity over quantity. So if you're only involved in one or two things, but your activity, your involvement is significant, if what you're doing is making a difference, if you're in leadership roles, those are the things that they're looking for, not just that you are a member of something. So, most students in colleges can choose to join a number of activities, but just being a member of clubs or things like that is not really what they're looking for. They would rather have you be president of one club than a member of, 5 clubs, right? So they're really seeking, again, quality over quantity. Okay. The other thing with this is that a lot of students feel that they're not really participating at school, that meaning at Santa Monica College, that they're doing things outside of school. That's perfectly fine. What these schools are looking for basically is, what are you doing besides just your classes, right? Besides your classes and getting good grades, what else are you doing? I do see here that there's a chat question about when is the latest you can submit an SAT or ACT score. Again, that would depend on the school. So we'd have to go. I'm going to address that when it comes to things like deadlines and when should I do this or that, it really depends on the individual school, finding out when they have deadlines for all these things. So, but yeah, I'll get back to that one later. So let's move on. So again, extracurricular, you really want to consider the significance of your participation, more so than just trying to load up on a lot of activities if what you're doing in these activities is not really significant, right? So work experience. This is kind of a subset of extracurricular, because I have a lot of students who feel that they're not doing any extracurricular. And when I talk to them about, well, what do you do when you're not in school? They'll tell me they're working 25, 30, 40 hours a week. And they're doing it very often because they need to pay rent, they need to eat food. So that's a perfectly acceptable extracurricular activity, is work. Yeah. So using the high school extracurricular activity model of, I need to be on the basketball team and I need to be doing all these things at school, it doesn't really work the same here at SMC. So, and again, a lot of the students that I've worked with who have gone on to be accepted to these schools, their number one extracurricular activity really was working, right? So some were doing very interesting things related to what they wanted to do. Some of them weren't. Some of them were working in retail jobs or working fast food or doing all kinds of different things just because they needed money. But those things still show that you have a good work ethic, that you have good time management skills, that you're good at, having responsibility and things like that. So it says in my slide here, many students have the perception that work is not as valuable as school-related extracurricular activities, but that's not necessarily the case. So if you work, and that's the majority of how you spend your time outside of school, that's perfectly fine. So Next, essays. Most of these schools are, well, all the elite schools are going to require you to write essays. Most of them are going to require you to write multiple essays. And the thing about this process is what you'll see is when you look at each individual school, they will have selected essays that are going to require you to write specific essays for them, and meaning that you can't write really one essay with the hope of just using it for all these different schools. um, they have it set up to where you're not really able to do that, because they're going to ask you questions that are going to be very specific, where you're going to again have to craft a response, an essay to their specific question, and you won't be able to use that essay for all the other schools that you apply to. So it's more work. Yeah, you're going to have to do a lot more writing, right? So, but that's how it's set up. So. Letters of recommendation. The majority of these schools also ask students to submit letters of recommendation. The number varies. If I had to throw out a number, it would be 2. Most of these schools require probably at least 2 letters of recommendation. And most of them are going to also be clear that what they want are letters from academic instructors. So not your neighbor, not high school teachers, not your boss at work, but they usually want letters to be able to discuss your, qualities you have as a student. So that would require you then to have relationships with instructors, right? To be able to go to them and ask them for these letters, right? And they are definitely looking more from an instructor, from a letter, from an instructor, than just the instructor telling them that you got an A in the class. That doesn't really help them. They can see that from the transcript, right? That you got an A in the class. They would hope to get more, information from the instructor beyond just the grade, right? So, and I know this is an area that, yeah, students, don't always feel comfortable asking people, or maybe they're the kind of student that, yeah, they get a lot of good grades, but they don't really have a lot of communication with their instructors. But these particular schools do require letters. The UCs, the Cal States, they do not, right? So that's another element of the transfer process that at the UC and Cal State level you're not going to encounter, but you will here with these private schools, with these elite schools. So if you advance far enough in the process, if you're lucky enough to get far enough in the process, you potentially will be asked to interview. And that is a very good thing. The overwhelming majority of students who apply to these schools will not be asked to interview. So the fact that you're asked to interview at all means that you've gone pretty far along in the process, that you've gone a long way, because again, most students are not asked to interview at all. So these interviews are usually, this being Southern California, they're probably going to be done here in Southern California, right? I wish I would tell you that, you're going to get flown back to Harvard or Princeton or whatever, but that generally does not happen. But Southern California, because it's such a huge market for all of these schools, they have representatives in the Southern California region pretty much all year round. So they can, set up interviews pretty much not very problematic in this area. A lot of these schools will also potentially use, for their interviewers, they will use alumni. So people at the school who volunteer to do this for the school. Again, because this is Southern California, we have a lot of alumni from all of these schools. So I've had students interview with alumni in the past, and they've met at Starbucks, or they've done it on the phone, or they've done Zoom chats or whatever. But so that is definitely something that if you ever got to that point where you've been asked to interview, that would be a very, very good thing. So in terms of the application process, right? We're having this workshop in April, mid-April. Most of these schools, the application deadlines have already passed, but not by very much. Most of these schools have relatively late application deadlines for the fall, which are basically the months of February, March, and April. That's pretty much the timeline for the applications. Much, much later than the UC and the Cal State, right? The UC and the Cal State, if you're not aware, the application deadline is the month of November. But for these schools, much, much later. And to be honest with you, the reason why the deadlines are so much later is because transfer students are not really central to their admission process. They are most concerned with dealing with their high school senior applicant pool. All of these schools, if they really wanted to, they can fill their entire school with just high school seniors, right? So meaning new students, right, that they would be bringing in would be coming in from high school. So, and the overwhelming majority of students that end up at these schools are going to be coming from high school. So transfer students are kind of an afterthought, really. So they're only going to be looking at transfers once they've finalized their high school class, and they know at that point kind of how much space they potentially have available for transfer students. So that's why these application deadlines are much later. The nice thing about the process, though, is because these application dates are later, you're not waiting around very long, right? You're going to apply, and you're going to know relatively quickly if you've been admitted or not, because the turnaround time, just based on the time, the way it's set up, is limited, right? So you're going to apply, and you're going to hear relatively soon. So most of these schools, when you apply, you're going to be using the common application. It's an application process that is administered through the College Board. That's a company, a private company that does a lot of different educational related type of things, including the Common App. They also do AP exams. They do the SAT. So this is one of the things that they do. So basically the way it works is the private schools will pay the College Board to basically run the admission paperwork. So, and they do it through this Common App. And so the way the Common App works is when you sign up for the Common App, it's going to ask you what schools you're interested in applying to. So if you have multiple schools that you're interested in, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, whatever, you're basically going to have a file for each one of those schools. And each one is going to have its own list of deadlines. It's going to have its own list of essay questions. It's going to have its own list of how many letters of recommendation they want and who they want them from. So all these, each individual school is going to have its own like portal, right? Its own file, and you're going to have to work each file separately, right? Unlike, for example, the UC, when you apply to the UC, you use one portal, you apply to all the schools through that one portal. The application is the same for all of them. These schools don't work like that. Yeah. So you're going to have to basically apply to each school one by one. So again, more work, right? We will have at SMC, we do offer workshops on how to navigate the Common App. We offer them definitely in the fall. I think we have a few in the spring, but definitely in the fall. And earlier in the spring, I think, is when we have them, right, to meet the deadline. So, but we do have applications. Oh, I'm sorry. We do have workshops that can also help you deal with the Common Application, right, when you, if you decide to do that. And the Common App, just so you know, it's not only for the elite schools, but it's also for USC and Loyola and schools like that as well. So, okay. So questions, I had questions. Oh, I do want to mention one other thing. All of these schools are private, and I just want to give you a sticker shock here. These schools are all going to run in terms of cost upwards of $70,000, and that would be per year and for 9 months. So the 9-month school year would mean from September more or less to June or late May, somewhere around there, right? So $70,000. I definitely have worked with a lot of students who that was their number one fear is, well, even if I got in, there would just be no way for me to pay for these schools because they're so expensive. And let me just say that these schools, more than any other schools in the United States, have substantial amounts of money to offer students, who are admitted, right, to attend their school. So financial aid is plentiful. I don't think I've ever had a student admitted to one of these schools who ended up not going because of the cost, at least. So the financial aid, process, if for those of you that, down the road feel that you're going to have to go through that as well. There are students who get into these schools who have the luxury of being able to pay for it just in cash, just because they have the money available to them. I just don't work with those students, not don't want to, they just don't end up in my office. The majority of the students I work with, not only are they concerned about the, getting in, obviously, but they were also concerned about how would they pay for these schools if they got in, right? So that's another element, right, that I can help you with. But so thank you for your attendance. I'm gonna exit now. I'm gonna go to the chat section. And wow, I had a lot of questions here. So I'm just going to kind of go over them if you don't mind. So let me go back to the very top. I do want to mention again, if you have not signed up for the workshop, I would encourage you to do so now. There'll be a link posted to the chat box that you can go to and click on and log on. Again, if you need verification for participation in the workshop, this is where you would do it, right? You would do it in the sign-in box. So, okay, so let's go back up here. Oh yeah, I do also want to thank Janet. Janet was my co-host. You never, I don't think, heard her, but she was the behind-the-scenes brains to this whole project. So I definitely want to thank her for her time. So, doesn't Princeton accept any transfer students? So when I showed you the transfer numbers and it said Princeton and it had all zeros on there, that's because when I did that slide, that was the first year that Princeton was actually going to take transfer students after not taking transfer students for at least over a decade. So I have to go back and update that slide. I'm sure Princeton has admitted students, but Princeton, when they decided to admit transfer students again, they actually came to Santa Monica College to talk to us about, just kind of the process and what would be a good, process to follow. And when they were here, they were talking about having transfer admission numbers that were probably going to be similar to Harvard, which again are very low. So I'm sure they didn't take very many students, but Princeton now is accepting transfer students. So yes. That was answered. Okay. Does having a high school, where to go here? Does having a high school on the SAT or SAT like 34, meaning a score, help the transfer application process, or do they only look at community college GPA? Yeah, I wish I could tell you they only looked at GPA, but yeah, they will look at the SAT score. That's a very high score. I think the highest on the ACT is a 38, I think. So, but yeah, that would be good to have. But what I'm dealing more with are students who maybe didn't have such a high score and they feel that they could score that high now if they took it now. And again, usually my response is, I would not recommend you take the test over again, right? But they are going to require that you submit a score. So if you have a score, a 34, that's going to be pretty good. That can only help you, right? So let me see. 2.7 GPA, 10 parents I found. Oh, okay. So I think this comment here, what if I have a 2.7, but I have 10 patents and I found a cure to cancer? Definitely apply, right? Those are those those situations where you have extraordinary success in other fields. It may not be in school necessarily, but yeah, if you're incredibly talented in other ways, that could definitely be a factor in your admission, and maybe your GPA is not that high, but again, yes, you found cures to cancer, or you're the top pianist in the world or whatever, right? So, yeah, we never know. The importance of having a balanced application and being passionate at what you do. Yes, I would say that would be a good way of looking at this. Do you have to have both fall and spring intake or just fall? Okay, I see what you're saying, because when you talk about having 30 units, if you come here, for example, first year, and I didn't mention this earlier, but I want to mention this now, these schools definitely want students who have been full-time. If at all possible, you definitely want to go to school full-time, right? So that said, if you come in first year and you're full-time in the fall and you're full-time in the spring, it's definitely possible to end up with 30 units, right? After that 1 year. And so, but yeah, I've actually seen students be admitted after having coursework just from the fall semester, right? Meaning that they were enrolled in the spring, they were full-time in the spring, they just didn't have grades. They just didn't have grades completed, right? But I've also had situations where some schools have waited until they see how the student does in the spring, and then they make their decision. So it could go a lot of different ways, right? Again, these schools, because they're private, they have a lot of flexibility in doing things kind of the way that they want to do them. So, okay, so, but you can definitely do the 30 units in 1 year. Yes. And it says primarily fall admits. Yes, these schools generally admit students for the fall semesters or the fall terms, right? Again, I don't know for sure if any of them don't or do accept applications for spring or mid-year, but for the most part, they do not. Generally, it's just fall. Yeah. Which schools accept spring transfers? Yeah, at top of my head, I don't know. I need to investigate them and find out which ones do. So, do you still need to provide SAT or ACT if you have over 30 units? Yes, you could have units and they still require the SAT or the ACT. You could be 45 years old and they still require the SAT or the ACT. So yeah, there's really no situation where they're not going to require those tests if they do require those tests. So, so when's the latest you can submit your SAT or ACT? Say that you're transferring this fall. Yeah, again, that would require to go to the website for the particular school, right? Because that's the first thing I ask students is whenever they ask me a question like that, I ask them, what school are you talking about, right? And then we'll go to that school and we'll look at their website and see what they say, right? If I had to give you a month for the testing, I would say probably the latest you're going to be looking at being able to take an exam probably is going to be either December or January. Those are probably going to be the latest test dates that they would probably accept. So I think I got too far. Let's see. I would recommend that you look up Elite University. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I don't think most elite transfers accept spring transfers. That's true, right? What if you were working on the limits and that limits your time you have for extracurriculars? Yeah, I spent, I think, quite a bit of time talking about exactly that I've had students who got into these schools and the only extracurricular activity they had really was work. But again, work can bring out a lot of qualities in a person, right? So don't think because it's, a job, it's not considered extracurricular or valuable or whatever. So yes, that would be fine. Working counts as extracurricular. What about college counselor advisor for the letter? Yes, there are some schools that do allow, counselor letters, right? But again, I've seen some schools where they don't. They want letters specifically from people or from instructors who the student has had for a course, right? So um, um, if I gave you any advice at all when it comes to the letters, I would side with getting letters that would be from instructors, but I would also hope that the letters from the instructors would have content that would talk more than just about your grade, the fact that you got an A or whatever, right? But what else, right? So, and that would require you to have had some kind of relationship with the instructors, right? That's the whole idea behind the letters. So, um, if we've completed 60 units, let me go back up here, is the chance of getting in lower? Um, boy, no, no, but I would say that if I did research on the students that these universities accept for transfer, I would say that probably the majority of them fit that model, right, of having that 1 year of college. So, but it doesn't exclude you. It doesn't disqualify you if you have more than 60 units. But I'm just trying to give you what they most prefer, right? So what they would prefer is that you transfer after a year. So, but I've had both cases. I've had students who have completed 60, right, and they've been admitted to, UCs and Cal States, but then they go on to elite schools if they've been admitted. So it could happen either way. Bottom line, um, is this sort of late to apply now? Yes, I would say, yeah, we'd have to look really hard to find a school that would have an application deadline this late for the schools that I'm talking about, right? They would be late or sometime in April. Yeah, we'd have to look. So, um, is the financial aid only available to U.S. citizens? Financial aid, meaning coming from the federal government and states, generally, yes, it is for U.S. citizens for the most part. But financial aid coming from the schools, that is debatable. There are schools that do have financial aid available for international students or AB 540 students, for sure. So again, it's one of those things that we'd have to investigate school by school. But how is Dartmouth for transfer? I would say, again, showing the numbers that I did, that not good, but again, it is a school that I wish more students would apply to. Um, oh, okay. Apparently, I missed two questions at 546 and 549. Let me go back. Sorry about that. Okay. I think I answered that one, the 546. If we've completed 60 units, is the chance of getting in lower? And I tried to say that statistically, maybe yes, but again, I've had students who have 60 units who have applied and been admitted to these schools. And then 549. Do you think personal hobbies? Oh, I'm sorry, I did miss this one. Do you think personal hobbies like reading and writing analysis of books might be considered an extracurricular activity? I mean, bottom line, extracurricular activity is anything you're doing outside of school. So if what you do with your time outside of school is read and do writing analysis of books, that's an extracurricular activity. Playing video games is an extracurricular activity. I don't know how successful that would be, for admission, but well, apparently there are two. It's 546. So thank you, Janet. Oh, instructors are ideal. Okay, I see. But yes, a letter from a counselor can count as well if it is a counselor that's worked with you a lot and can speak of your academic development. Yes. If you apply early, can you get the decision earlier? Okay, that's the one I missed. So I would say probably not. Yeah, I would say that most of these schools, they're going to send out all their admission decisions pretty much at the same time. Like I said, because the deadlines for these schools are so much later than a lot of other schools. What they're most concerned about is finalizing their high school class. So it's not until they've done that do they really look at their transfer pool of students. So yeah, you're really not going to get probably a decision just because you applied sooner, because yeah, they're pretty much waiting on getting their high school class finalized. So um, okay, so I hope I got those. Um, I did the Dartmouth. Cornell takes spring transfers. Yeah, so that's one of the ones it does. Yeah. So um, letters of recommendation, the importance of going to professor office hours. Yes, that's from a student, but absolutely. I wish more students just in general for their own benefit took advantage of going to office hours. But yes, that's where those um, um, kind of connections are made right outside of class, where you can really have good conversations with your instructors that can then produce really good letters of recommendation, right? So 100% agree with that student, Teddy. Yeah, thank you. 557, boy, I'm really, okay, a lot of questions. Oh, what about online versus classes in person? Do elite universities care about the difference? I know the University of Ottawa in Canada cares about the difference. I know Ottawa isn't elite, but I'm curious. You know what? When elite education kind of started, these schools basically gave the indication that they would not accept online coursework. Right now, Santa Monica College, we've never listed coursework on our transcript with any indication that the course was taken online. So we've never had an issue with that. Now, having said that, again, if they were to ask you, are any of these courses that you took, or, were they online? And, if you were honest and said, well, yes, they were, right? So again, these schools being private, they could have their own policies on how they deal with things like that. But I can tell you that I've never had a student admitted to these schools that have ever had an issue with that. But to be honest with you as well, I don't think the majority of the students that I've worked with in the past who have been admitted to these schools really took a lot of classes online. I think most of them were in a classroom. So, okay, Cornell letters. Cornell does take spring transfers, but if you're an international student, okay, yeah, that's elite universities. How much do they consider your high school transcript? They really don't. Yeah, they really don't. Now, that's not to say that if you were not an unbelievably gifted high school student, that's not going to be a good sign. That's going to be good, but I've had students who were not good high school students. I've had students who did not finish high school, who dropped out, got the GED, and they have been admitted to these schools. So yeah, the bottom line is by being transfer students, you're demonstrating that you can do college level work, which kind of puts the whole issue of high school, kind of to the side. So does it affect your chances of getting into these schools if you a little bit older? No, in fact, you know what, to be honest with you, the majority of students that I have worked with personally who have been admitted to these schools have been older. So you right, I'm 25. So yeah, you're this type of student that I've worked with in the past. The younger students, I really haven't worked with them, not because I don't want to, but they just haven't come into my office showing an interest in applying to these schools. So, and the ones that I've been most successful with are the ones that have been older. So yes, definitely, you're definitely, a candidate, right? If you want to apply. If I have 30 units completed at the end of this semester, and I think I don't know what you mean by this semester. I'm assuming you mean spring, but I will not be able to take classes next fall and spring. Can I still apply next year as a transfer student to these universities? Or would the fact that I spent 1 year not attending? No, except what they're going to want to know, what any school is going to want to know, not only these schools, but UCs and Cal States, whenever they see a break, whenever they see that you were not in school, they're going to want to know why. Why is it that you were not going to school? And so you don't talk about your reason, but your theoretical you know, plan, whatever. Yeah. But they're going to want to know, what were you doing? If you were not in school, what were you doing? So what were you doing with your time there? Um, what if you're younger, like 17 years old with 60 credits? Awesome. Again, I've never worked with a student like that, not because I don't want to, I just never had one walk in my office. So yeah, definitely come in. I'd love, or I say my office, but someday I will have an office again, but contact me online or whatever. We can talk about it. But yeah, you'd still be a good candidate. So definitely. If you are rejected, can you reapply again the year after? And does it have an effect on your chance of being accepted? Okay. These schools are going to tell you that no, they do not look at, if you reapply, are they going to automatically deny you again because you applied the year prior and they denied you the year prior? No. But if you apply a year later, there's no guarantee, right? There's no guarantee of anything. But yes, you can definitely apply again. And that would go for any other school, UCs, Cal States. I've had students denied those schools as well, and they reapply. And some have gotten in the second time and some have not, right? So, but they don't have a rule that says that you can't apply, right? So would it be a good idea to take a semester off so as to not exceed 30 units before transferring? So you can go in as a sophomore. Well, again, my opinion is I would not do that because the chances of getting into these schools is so low to begin with that it's hard for me to make these schools look like your kind of number one choice, right? So I would not do that. I would. That's why when I went over the slides, I said using UC and Cal State is like kind of like your model for transfer. That's the kind of way that I would be looking at this, right? So that you definitely have those options available to you if you want them, right? Or other private schools that just don't happen to be as competitive, right? So, yeah, I don't think spending time out of school would be my number one option. Yeah. How do we get an appointment with you? I have tried, but I am told that F1 students can only see international students. Counselors, no, I mean, I've had international students in the past make appointments with me for this exact reason. So if you told the person who you're trying to make an appointment, when you're trying to make an appointment, if you tell them that you're an international student, but you want to meet with me because you want to get information for these private schools, right? You should be allowed to do that. You're also welcome to email me directly. So you can email me directly. My email is my last name, which was on the top of the, in fact, I can go back. Oh, you know what? Can I type in here? Yeah, here we go. Let me type it in here. So there's my email. So you're welcome to email me and we can, try to figure something out, right? But yeah. Again, any student who's interested in applying to these schools, I'm more than happy to sit down and or communicate with you in some way. I say sit down, but yeah, somehow. So I hope we do get back to that sooner than later. I definitely am interested in that. So thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Incredible questions. Thank you so much for taking the time. This way of doing this workshop is not my favorite. I usually do this workshop in a classroom. I hope to get back to that, but thank you all so much for taking your time to listen to all this information. I hope I see a lot of you or work with a lot of you in some way in the future. So thank you. I'm going to sign off now. Thank you very much. Oh my God.